There's a kind of silence that settles over a man when the world decides he no longer exists. Not the silence of death, not the silence of peace, but the silence of being forgotten while you are still breathing, still walking, still carrying everything you were never allowed to put down. This is a story about that silence, and about one man who lived inside it for 50 years. His name was Hiroo Onoda, and if you have never heard of him, that is almost the point. Born in 1922 in a small village in Japan, Onoda grew up in a country that was teaching its young men that to die for the emperor was the highest honor a human being could achieve. He was not unusual in this. Millions of young Japanese men absorbed this teaching like water into soil. It became part of who they were before they even had a chance to decide who they wanted to be. By the time Onoda was old enough to hold a rifle, the war had already decided his future for him. He trained as an intelligence officer, not a regular soldier pushed into a trench and told to hold a line. He was trained to think, to survive, to operate alone or in small groups behind enemy lines. He was trained to be a ghost, and the terrible thing about being trained to be a ghost is that sometimes the world lets you become one. In December of 1944, Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders were specific and absolute. He was to conduct guerrilla warfare. He was to disrupt enemy operations. He was never to surrender. He was never to take his own life, and he was to hold out until Japanese forces return. Those were his orders. He received them from a superior officer. He acknowledged them. He intended to follow them. That was who Hiroo Onoda was, a man who followed orders. He did not know, as he disappeared into the jungle of Lubang Island, that those orders would define the next 30 years of his life. American forces took the island in early 1945. Most Japanese soldiers were killed or captured. A few, like Onoda, fled into the dense jungle interior and kept fighting. By 1945, Onoda's group consisted of himself and 3 other men. They hid in the hills. They raided villages for food. They destroyed rice stores and burned crops. They ambushed patrols. They believed with complete and total certainty that the war was still going on, that Japan was still fighting, that their duty remained unchanged. Then came August 1945. Japan surrendered. The Second World War ended, and Hiroo Onoda did not know. Or rather, he knew something was being said. Leaflets were dropped over the jungle. Newspapers were thrown from aircraft. Loudspeakers announced the end of the war from the edges of the tree line. But Onoda and his men looked at these things and saw propaganda. Enemy tricks designed to lure Japanese soldiers out of hiding so they could be captured or killed. They had been trained to expect exactly this kind of psychological manipulation. They had been told the enemy would try to deceive them. So when the enemy told them the war was over, they believed it was a lie. Their training had prepared them perfectly to disbelieve the truth. This is one of the most devastating aspects of Onoda's story. He was not a foolish man. He was not deluded in any simple sense. He was a highly trained, deeply disciplined soldier who applied his intelligence consistently and methodically to a situation that had quietly ceased to exist. Every piece of evidence that the war had ended, he interpreted through the lens of a man who had been told to expect deception. His very competence became the mechanism of his isolation. The years passed. One by one, his companions left. One surrendered in 1950. 2 were killed, one in 1954 and one in 1972, in confrontations with Filipino police and civilians. By the early 1970s, Onoda was alone, a single man in the jungle, decades deep into a war that the rest of the world had closed like a book and shelved. Think about what that means for a moment. Really think about it. While Onoda was sleeping on jungle floors and rationing stolen food and sharpening his blade and listening for enemy movements, the world outside had completely transformed. Japan had been rebuilt from ash into one of the most prosperous nations on earth. The men who had been his enemies were now his country's trading partners. The emperor, in whose name he was fighting, had become a constitutional figurehead. Children who had not yet been born when he entered that jungle had grown up, gone to college, gotten married, had children of their own. The world had moved through decades of change, through new wars and new technologies and new fears, and somewhere in all of that motion, one man had been completely, absolutely left behind. He did not feel left behind, that is the thing. He felt like a soldier doing his duty. Every morning he woke up and he was Hiroo Onoda, Imperial Japanese Army, intelligence officer, holding his position as ordered. The mission had not changed. The orders had not changed. He had not changed. The world had changed. But the world's changes were not his concern. His concern was the mission. Filipino civilians and police encountered him periodically over the decades. There were firefights, people were killed. From the perspective of the Filipino communities near Lubang Island, there was a dangerous armed man in their jungle who would shoot at people without warning. From Onoda's perspective, he was a soldier engaging enemy combatants in an active war zone. Both perspectives made complete internal sense. They simply occupied entirely different realities. The Philippine and Japanese governments made attempts to locate him and communicate that the war had ended. His own family recorded messages that were broadcast into the jungle. His former commanding officers sent letters. None of it reached him in a way he could accept. A man who has been trained to distrust the enemy's messages and who genuinely cannot tell the difference between enemy messages and genuine communications has no way to update his understanding of the world. He was not being stubborn. He was being exactly what he had been made to be. By 1974, the outside world had largely given up on Hiroo Onoda. He was known in a distant and somewhat abstract way as a peculiar holdout, an anachronism, a soldier still fighting a war 3 decades cold. There had been searches, there had been announcements. There had been a period in the early 1970s when a Japanese university student named Norio Suzuki decided, apparently almost on a whim, that he wanted to find Onoda. While governments and military organizations had failed, this young man walked into the jungle with a tent and a camera and an extraordinary amount of patience, and he found him. Suzuki spent time with Onoda. He told him the war was over. Onoda listened but would not act on the information. He was not dismissive of Suzuki. He was not hostile. He simply explained that he could not abandon his post or accept the end of the war based on the word of a civilian traveler. He needed to hear it from his commanding officer. He needed proper orders. Without those orders, he would continue his mission. That was who he was. That was what he had always been. Suzuki went back to Japan with photographs. The photographs were proof that Onoda was alive, still in the jungle, still waiting. The Japanese government, confronted with this evidence, tracked down Onoda's former commanding officer, a man named Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had long since left the military and was working as a bookseller. Taniguchi was asked to travel to the Philippines, to walk into the jungle, to find the man he had commanded 30 years ago, and to give him the orders he had been waiting for. On March 9, 1974, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi stood in a jungle clearing on Lubang Island and formally relieved Hiroo Onoda of his duty. Onoda was 51 years old. He had been in the jungle for nearly 30 years. He had gray in his hair and lines in his face, and a body that had endured decades of survival in one of the hardest environments on Earth. He was wearing a uniform that he had maintained and repaired so many times it was barely the original garment. He carried a rifle that still functioned. He had 300 rounds of ammunition. He had several hand grenades. He was, by any measure, still a soldier. When Taniguchi gave him his orders, Onoda wept. And then he presented his sword in surrender to the Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who pardoned him for the killings he had committed, understanding that this man had genuinely believed he was at war. The world watched, and the world did not quite know what to feel. Here was a man who had done something that was simultaneously heroic and tragic, admirable and devastating. He had demonstrated a quality of loyalty and discipline and commitment that most human beings will never come close to matching. He had survived alone in a jungle for 3 decades through sheer force of will and training and belief. He had never given up. He had never surrendered to despair. He had held on, but he had also killed people. Filipino farmers and police officers who were simply going about their lives decades after a war had ended. He had destroyed crops and burned property and lived as a source of fear and danger in communities that had no idea why this man was still there. The war that gave his actions meaning had ended before most of those people were adults. Some of them had barely been born when Japan surrendered. The complexity of Onoda's story resists simple conclusions. He is not purely a hero. He is not purely a victim. He is something more uncomfortable than either of those things. He is a human being who is shaped so completely by an institution and an ideology that he could not find his way out of it, even when that institution had collapsed and that ideology had been thoroughly defeated. He had been made into something, and the thing he had been made into had outlasted the reason for its making. He returned to Japan and found himself in a country he did not recognize. The Japan he had left in 1944 was a militarist empire at war. The Japan he returned to in 1974 was a pacifist democracy at peace. The language was the same. Some of the faces were familiar. But the values, the structures, the fundamental orientation of the society had transformed. He was a man out of time in his own homeland. He gave interviews. He wrote a memoir. He was celebrated by some as a symbol of loyalty and endurance, and criticized by others who felt that his story glorified a militarist ideology that Japan had rightly abandoned. He struggled with what he had done and what had been done to him. He spoke about the difficulty of reconciling his actions with the reality that the war had been over for all those years. He was not unaware of the tragedy embedded in his own story. He carried it. Eventually he left Japan. He moved to Brazil, where a Japanese immigrant community existed in the interior, and he worked on a cattle ranch and found a kind of peace in physical labor and open land. He later returned to Japan and established a nature school for young people, teaching survival skills and self-reliance in the wilderness. He poured into those children some of what the jungle had given him, the parts that were worth keeping, the parts that had nothing to do with war. He died in 2014 at the age of 91, but this story does not really end with his death. It continues because of what it asks us. What does it mean to be loyal to something that no longer exists? What does it mean to serve a purpose that has dissolved? How many of us are, in our own ways, still fighting wars that ended years ago, still defending positions that no longer need defending, still operating according to orders that were given to us long ago by people or institutions or versions of ourselves that have since moved on. Onoda's story is extreme. It is singular. There's nobody else quite like him in the historical record, but the impulse that kept him in that jungle, the deep human need to be faithful to something, to have a mission, to not be the person who gives up, that impulse is not strange or foreign. It lives in a great many people in a great many forms. The soldier who can't come home from a war that ended decades ago. The person who is still fighting a battle in a relationship that finished years ago. The professional who is still working from a playbook written for a world that no longer exists. The ideological true believer who keeps holding positions the rest of the world moved past a generation ago. Onoda is an extreme version of something recognizable, a man who could not receive new information because his training had made him unable to trust it. There is something else, though, something quieter and harder to articulate. Onoda was forgotten. For 50 years, the official story of the Second World War did not include him because including him would have required the war to still be happening in some sense, and nobody wanted that. He was an inconvenience to the narrative of closure, a loose thread that the official story preferred not to pull. The war ended. We know when it ended. We have the documents. We have the ceremonies. We have the photographs of men signing surrender papers on the decks of battleships. The war ended, and yet here was this man in a jungle, and the war had not ended for him. And acknowledging that fully would mean acknowledging that the endings we declare are sometimes only partial, sometimes only official, sometimes only true for the people with the power to decide what counts as true. The world forgot him because remembering him was inconvenient, and then the world remembered him and did not entirely know what to do with him. And he came home to a country that wanted to celebrate him and also wanted to forget everything he represented, and he lived the rest of his life carrying all of that, as people do, as people always do. There is a photograph of Onoda taken when he emerged from the jungle in 1974. He is standing in a clearing in his worn uniform, and he is looking at the camera with an expression that is very difficult to read. He does not look broken. He does not look triumphant. He looks like a man who has just been told something that will take a very long time to process. He looks like a man who is beginning, at the age of 51, the long work of learning that the war is over. Most of us are luckier than Hiroo Onoda. Most of us have people around us who can tell us when things have changed, and we have enough openness to hear them. Most of us do not have to wait 30 years for someone to walk into our jungle and give us permission to stop fighting. But the jungle is real, the war is real, and the orders we were given, the ones we carry without questioning because we received them from people or systems we trusted completely, those are real too. Onoda's story is not a story about the Second World War, not really, and it is a story about what happens when a human being is shaped so thoroughly by a cause that they can no longer see beyond it. It is a story about loyalty pushed past the point of reason and emerging on the other side as something that looks almost like madness but feels from the inside like integrity. It is a story about the gap between the official end of things and the actual end of things, about how history closes chapters that individual human beings are still living inside. And it is, finally, a story about being remembered. For 50 years, Hiroo Onoda fought in a war that nobody acknowledged was still happening. For 50 years, he was a ghost, a rumor, a problem that nobody wanted to solve. And then the world remembered him all at once and crowded around him with cameras and questions and opinions. And he had to learn very quickly how to be a person again instead of a soldier. He managed it, not perfectly, not without cost, but he managed it. He planted things, he taught children, he found quiet. And somewhere in the jungle of Lubang Island there are still traces of him. Paths he walked, positions he held, places where a fire burned on a night 3 decades into a war that was already over. The jungle has grown back over all of it now, but it was real. Every single day of it was real, and the man who lived it deserves to be remembered, not as a curiosity, not as a symbol, not as a cautionary tale or a legend or a punchline, but as a human being who did his best with what he had been given in circumstances that were not entirely of his making, and who found his way eventually imperfectly home.